Greetings and welcome back to the eighth mini lecture on the Constitution. And in the previous mini lecture, I really talked about the movement or the evolution from a rebellion to a revolution, and the bulk of that energy were in documents, common sense, and the Declaration of Independence. Now, one of the things that makes the Declaration of Independence so important is that in the Declaration we sever our ties with Britain. In other words, we make the claim that Britain is no longer ruling us, that we are now an independent in a new nation, and therefore we have to govern ourselves. And so if you look in your textbook, in every textbook I've ever used, and I've taught for a long time, I started my teaching career in the 1980s, so that gives you an idea of how long I've been teaching at the UC, at UC Davis, at the Cal State, at Stanislaus, and at four different community colleges. And virtually everywhere I've been, my colleagues all look at the Articles of Confederation as our first failed constitution. I take a contrary view. It's a minority view, and it's certainly one that you may not agree with, and that's fine. Certainly, your textbook is going to frame this as a failure. And I point that out in the first point under the Articles of Confederation, the dominant view of political scientists. So I'm being really upfront with you. I'm telling you my views of minority perspective, but being in the minority doesn't necessarily mean that it's wrong. It just means that you're in the minority. So the dominant view of political scientists is that the first constitution of our country was an abject failure and was quickly replaced by our current constitution. Now, it's my belief that the Articles of Confederation was a prerequisite. In other words, that the Articles of Confederation was valuable, and it was valuable because we learned a lot of lessons. And here's the basic argument, and I didn't put this in the notes, but in this particular case, the people drafting our government, our first government, our founding fathers who drafted the Articles of Confederation believed that the only evil politically was a government too strong. That's what we were fighting a revolution against. We were fighting a revolution against Great Britain. That national government was too powerful. It had abused our rights. And therefore, we were going to create a government that was much weaker and that invested power in the hands of the states so that this national government could not become too strong or take away your rights. But what these people didn't realize is that there is a second political evil. If you have a government that is too strong, there is no question that you risk tyranny. And certainly you can take a look at the former Soviet Union, at Nazi Germany. There are lots of examples of national governments far too strong. But if you have a government that is too weak, you risk a different political evil, and that's anarchy. And certainly it's a very different political evil, but it is just as dangerous. Now, your textbook only refers to one of the next 2 points I'm going to make, so let me distinguish the two arguments from you. Go back to the crisis of identity that I introduced earlier. Remember? One of the legacies of having a lengthy colonial period that lasted 150 years, of course, is the fact that people who were fighting the revolution overwhelmingly identified themselves with their states. And I use the example of my ancestors, the Randalls, who were fighting for Connecticut, and the Barnheisers, who were fighting for Pennsylvania. They weren't fighting for a national government. And so if you have people, excuse me, if you have people who are identifying with their state, then it only makes sense that when they create a government, they're determined to invest sovereignty or political power in the hands of the state. So it is my belief, and this is not discussed in Greenberg, that the Articles of Confederation was a state-centric system, and I underlined that, and you should know that political power was in the hands of the states under the Articles, but that it's logical and it makes sense given their identity at the time. Now, the other argument is discussed at some length in Greenberg and Page, and that is the colonists were fighting a war against what they perceived was British tyranny, and they did not want to repeat that mistake in the Constitution. I'm not telling you that Greenberg and Page are wrong, because there is no question that that is a true argument. But what I'm telling you is that I believe the other, and I believe it is equally important. And this is what I would add to this chapter if I were co-authoring the chapter with Greenberg and Page, is that I would insist that there be a discussion about just how deeply rooted people's loyalty was to their states. Think about this. And what I'm trying to tell you is that people throughout the country viewed themselves much like Southerners did during the Civil War. Right? The Civil War has lots of layers to it. Certainly, one of the layers is slavery. It's an important one. There's a difference in constitutional interpretation. I'll talk about the 10th Amendment in states' rights versus Article 1, Section 8, the Northern view, the 10th Amendment, the Southern view. But what most people ignore in the Civil War is you fundamentally have a war of identity. It is my belief that the crisis of identity is the first crisis that all new nations must overcome. And the United States did not fully figure that out and solve it definitively until the Civil War. So when the Civil War breaks out in 1861, you have the Northern view, and the Northern view is I am an American, first and foremost, who happens to come from a state like New York or Ohio or Pennsylvania or Michigan or whatever state it happens to be. The Southern view was, yes, I am an American, but my primary loyalty is to a state. And let me give you an example. When the Civil War broke out, Abraham Lincoln offered the command of the Union Army to the most prominent general alive at the time, General Lee. The little cavalry officer with the size 4 shoes. It's hard to think of Robert E. Lee as a man with like a size 4 shoe, but you want smaller guys on horses and you want bigger guys in your infantry. Lee said that he was honored to be asked by Lincoln, that his forefathers had helped found this country, but he said he couldn't accept because his first loyalty lay with Virginia and he could never bear arms against her. Now, in one of those interesting ironies, Lee was not a slave owner. He had freed his slaves a couple of decades earlier. A lot of people in the South were fighting for slavery. I would contend, even though relatively few Southerners had slaves as a percentage of the population, they certainly fought for that idea. But I believe in Lee's case, the primary reason that he took over command of the Army of Northern Virginia was this notion that his first loyalty was to the state. So the Civil War is a war of identity, and the Northern view prevailed. And of course, national supremacy is the result. And there have certainly been wars in other parts of the world between regional governments in the national government. So what I want you to know out of that first section is to understand how and why political power was really rooted in the hands of the states. And essentially, the national government only had the power the states allowed them to have. In the 5 minutes that are left, I want to go over numeral 3, the structure of the national government. And the point that I would make here is that the structure of the national government under the Articles of Confederation was completely different than what we have today. Today, we have three incredibly strong national institutions. Most people say that the president is the strongest individual in the world. It is the linchpin of the American political system. The Supreme Court is one of the few Supreme Courts in the world that is incredibly powerful, that has the power of judicial review. And of course, our Congress is considered by many to be the most formidable and independent legislatures in the world. So three very powerful institutions sharing power. All of them powerful, and all of them balancing power and checking and balancing one another. If you look under the Articles of Confederation, the powers are very different. Look at letter A. There was no federal court system. There were only state court systems. As a result, there was no actor capable of resolving disputes between the states. And let me give you a couple of examples. New York and New Jersey both claimed islands in the harbor. So these battles go back to the 1780s. And the last of those battles was finally resolved in federal court in 1999. It was an island that has personal significance for my family. It is an island that I believe all of you have heard of, called Ellis Island. My great-grandmother and great-grandfather were immigrants from Sicily. They were both processed at Ellis Island, and I don't know what happened to my great-grandfather's paperwork, but my great-grandmother's paperwork, I believe, is still in the family, and her paperwork says that she was processed at Ellis Island, New York. That may or may not be true. And the reason that may or may not be true is that the courts actually ruled that the boundary between New York and New Jersey go right through the island. So some of the island is in New York and some is in New Jersey. Another battle was fishing rights in the Potomac. Who had predominant fishing rights? Was it Maryland or was it Virginia? And there was no way to resolve that. B, there was only a ceremonial executive officer without modern powers of the office. In fact, the president was called the president of the Congress under the Articles of Confederation. Under the Articles of Confederation, the president couldn't veto, which is what I think of as presidential power. Did not have certain appointment powers. Was not commander in chief. Etc. So there was only a ceremonial leader. And so that means that the only real power in this government, and put some stars with C, the Congress was a unicameral legislature, a one-house legislature with representation based on geography. Each state got one vote regardless of population or size. And before you begin to think that that is strange, we have an institution today called the U.S. Senate that is based on geography. Every state, whether it's huge, like Alaska or Texas or California, gets 2 senators, or tiny, like Rhode Island or Delaware or Connecticut. If they have a lot of people like California, they have 2 senators, or if they have very few like Wyoming, they have 2 senators. So if you want to think about what the Congress looked like, a little bit different. Today, each state has 2 senators. Under the Articles, each state only got 1 vote. The second big difference in your notes is that 2/3 of the states, not a majority of senators, 2/3 of the states were needed to pass laws, and all of the states were needed to pass constitutional amendments. So keep in mind that that system isn't particularly democratic. There were about 500,000 people in Virginia and about 23,000 people in Georgia, and under this system, they both had the same political power. In the next mini lecture, we will talk about the weaknesses of the Articles and why it disintegrated.